Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at the creation of game utilities with our game map by adding navigation to the 3D view. This was our application at the end of the last video. We have displayed a 3D map, and this 3D map can be displayed for any part of the terrain. However, currently there is no ability to move around this map. You have to go back to the original large map and click on another area. What we're going to add today is a navigation facility at the bottom right-hand corner of this dialog. So let's go in and have a look at the code. In order to achieve this, we're going to be adding another library. So we've now added the Button Plus library, which will allow us to put icons on buttons. Next, I'm going to amend the vertical offset by increasing it from 10 to 15. We've also made a minor modification to the library load JPEG as bitmap to comment out these first two sections here of the types and the declaration of one function and one subroutine. This is because the new library, the Button Plus library we've added, already has these declares. So if we try running our application now, load up our world map, and click on an area of the large graphics map. We can now see that the vertical offset for the mountains shows them as higher on the map. This makes mountains more distinct from the lower land. So let's now go back to the code and put the changes in we'll need to make to allow navigation of this 3D map. So to support these changes, we're going to put in some more graphics. So we're going to have icons for east, west, north and south, and also a terrain compass and a terrain icon. So to support these new graphics, we're going to have to create some new constants. These will be the constants that define each of the new objects on our dialog. Plus, we've added another 5 resource icons to the next part of our code. So now that we have the graphics out of the way, let's have a look at the rest of the code. In the main dialog, we have not yet assigned an icon to the dialog itself. This will be the dialog that shows for our application. So just before we show the dialog, we will set its icon. And we're setting this to the value 2001, which is our terrain icon. With icons, the very first icon defined in your resource list will be the icon that is automatically assigned by Windows to the application itself. Next, we will look at the terrain info dialog. Now we're going to make this dialog slightly larger to accommodate the new objects we want to place on it. So we're increasing it to 609 by 418. And having done that, we want to add the new objects to the dialog. We're going to be adding most of these as image buttons. And we're also going to add the compass in the center of these buttons as a graphics control. So there are our new image buttons. One for north, one for south, one for west, and one for east. Having defined each of these objects, we now have to populate those objects with our controls. So we're going to use the Button Plus library to set up each of the buttons. So if we try running our application now to see how these new graphics look. And there we can see the new graphics at the bottom right-hand corner. I'll come back to the terrain map in a moment, but we can now see we have buttons for north, south, west and east. And we also have a step field. I intend using this step field to say how many terrains we will actually step north, south, east or west at one time. This will allow a fine control of down to 1 terrain or up to perhaps 10 terrains. As we're going to allow the user to dynamically move the viewpoint of our 3D map, we'll need to change the way the 3D map is actually called. So let's go back to the code. When the show dialog terrain info function is called, which displays this dialog to the user, we're passing in an X and Y coordinate. This is to indicate which terrain the user is actually centering the map upon. So as the user is going to be moving this point of origin, we'll need to store these X and Y values, and we're going to use the dialog set user command to store them in the dialog itself. So here is our dialog set user commands, storing the X and the Y coordinates in slots 1 and 2. As we're going to allow the user to move around the map, there is a small snippet of the main graphics control. This also will have to move at the same time we're moving the 3D map. So we're going to grab part of the terrain map and display it as a small map on this dialog. So we're going to perform that by using a small map function. This takes a number of parameters: the dialog we're currently on, the handle for the small map, the payment dialog from where the information has been taken, the handle of the large graphics territories map, and the X and Y coordinates. So let's create that new function. This is a fairly straightforward function and will be similar to some of the routines we've used in the previous videos. We're using the graphics attach command to specify the graphic control we wish to populate. We're then using the graphics clear command to make sure that graphic is completely clear before we start drawing on it. We can then get the size, determine the offsets, and use the graphic copy command to copy from the main territorial map on the first dialog to this new graphics map, and then redraw it on the screen. In addition, we have to make a small change to the draw polygons terrain function. In the previous video, this function drew the 3D terrain map on this dialog only once. As we're going to allow the user to move around this 3D map, there is a possibility that some mountains might still show as polygons on the background. Therefore, we want to use the graphics clear command to ensure that the graphics control is completely blank before we start. So the simple addition of a graphics clear command before we start drawing to the graphics control will solve this problem. So now that we have all that in place, our next task is to put some code behind each of the buttons that allow the user to navigate. Clicking on these buttons will trigger an event in the callback function. So let's go into that callback function and put some code in. So in the callback function, the event handler of this dialog, we have a WM command section. This is fairly lightly coded at the moment, and this is where our code is going to go. But before we do that, we're going to have to make a slight change to the variables at the beginning of this function. Currently, the X and Y variables within this function are declared as locals. This was fine in the previous video because this function would only be called once when the dialog was displayed. We'll want to store the X and Y coordinates as static variables so that they are remembered between each call. Plus, we're going to set up the step. This is the number of terrains we're going to move up, down, left or right. So there are our redefined static variables. So let's now put the event handlers in. So here is the event handler to pick up changes to the step field. A simple control get text will get the value and store it in our step variable. And this is a static variable. Next, we'll have to put an event in each of the navigation buttons for north, south, east and west. So each of these is going to be remarkably similar. Let's look at the one for the north button. Once the button is clicked, we're testing the Y coordinate, subtracting from it the step variable. So if the step variable is 1, we're testing to make sure that the Y coordinate is greater than 0. This will ensure we're not moving off the edge of the map. If it passes that test, we're then subtracting the step variable from the Y coordinate to give us a new Y coordinate. We can then attach to the graphics control we wish to draw and call draw polygons and then redraw the image to the user. We're then calling our new function, the small map, to redraw the small map on the screen. And of course, we're doing exactly the same thing for each of the other buttons. For moving south, we're adding to the Y coordinate. For moving west, we're using the X coordinate and taking the step from it. And moving east, we're adding the step to the Y coordinate. Before we run our application, there is one final change we need to make. The step variable is a static, so we're going to set it to the value 1 in our initialization section of the dialog. So let's try running the application now. If we select our map and pick a location, we can now see the 3D map and the small section of the main map displayed. If we click north, the terrain map for the 3D moves north, as also does the small terrain map. If we try moving to the east, it will move quite happily to the east, one terrain at a time. The same for the south, and the same for the west. If we increase the step size, for example to the value 5, it will move 5 terrains at a time, allowing the user to navigate quite happily and quickly around the map. So what we've achieved today is we've taken our original code of displaying a small section of the terrain map and a 3D version of the terrain map, and we've given the user navigation controls to move north, south, east and west by either a single terrain at a time or up to a value of perhaps 10. This allows the user to quite easily move around the map. Hopefully you'll find this approach useful in your applications, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.